Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 12, December 1931 to January 1932.
After a 24-hour stay at Midway, where the final arrangements were concerted, the expedition left on December 27th for the second stage of its voyage, the 1,034-mile run to Wake Island. The battle fleet sailed a day later, steering a course more to the northward. The weather, up to this date, had been propitious, but on the night of December 29th, a violent southwest gale broke. Huge waves swept over the transports, causing much damage to boats and deck gear, while the lookout men, blinded by flying spray, could no longer see the dim stern lights that marked the position of the ships, this being the only illumination permitted now that the expedition was nearing enemy waters. At 1 a.m. on the 30th, when the storm was at its height, the transport Marquette was rammed by her next astern, the Arlington, which struck her a violent blow on the port quarter, tearing a great rent in her side and putting the steering gear out of action. Instantly, the damaged ship began to fill, her plight being rendered hopeless by the mountainous seas which broke over her as she lost way and became unmanageable. Searchlight signals apprised the rest of the scattered convoy of the disaster, but it was little they could do to help their ill-starred consort. As the 1,200 troops on board the Marquette tried to muster on deck, scores were swept to their doom by the waves that washed over the waterlogged vessel. No boats could live in such a sea, and of the few that were lowered, none survived for more than a minute. By now, however, destroyers were on the scene. With splendid gallantry, the commanders of the Somers, Worden, and Bancroft brought their craft alongside the sinking ship, disregarding the imminent peril of being dashed against her hull. Seeing help near at hand, most of the soldiers threw themselves into the water, and though many were engulfed, 530 were picked up by the destroyers. Half an hour after the collision, the Marquette gave a last lurch and foundered by the stern. Including members of the crew, upwards of 900 lives were lost. Nor did this complete the full tale of the disaster, for at 1:30 a.m., the Arlington reported herself to be making water fast and unable to steer. Her bows had been stove in when she ran into the Marquette, and a large section of plating below the waterline wrenched away by a great sea that struck her as she was drawing clear of the former ship. With the forward bulkhead showing signs of collapse, she dared not steam ahead. One of the forward compartments was flooded, the forecastle was nearly awash, and the propellers were lifting out of the water. Had the sea been calm, she might have remained afloat, but in view of the weather then prevailing, it was clear she was doomed. There was nothing for it but to abandon the ship, but before launching his boats on that tempestuous sea, Captain Starkey requested the destroyers to pump oil on the raging waters, and by this expedient several boatloads of men contrived to reach the warships. Others jumped overboard and were picked up, while more were saved by lifelines. The Arlington sank at 3 a.m., taking down with her about 150 men. By noon on the following day, when the sea had become less rough, the shipwrecked troops saved by the destroyers were put on board other transports, and the voyage was resumed, though the tragedy of the night cast a gloom over the whole expedition. Apart from the heavy loss of life, a quantity of munitions and other essential stores had gone down in the two ships. Several vessels had sustained such injury to derricks and other gear as would prevent them from discharging rapidly. Worse still was the loss of the lighters, which it had been necessary to cast adrift when the storm began. 4 were recovered, but the others had vanished. As these craft were to have been the means of getting a great part of the artillery and heavy stores ashore at Port Lloyd, their absence would inevitably lead to delay, and might therefore have serious consequences. On reviewing the position, Admiral Doyle felt grave doubts as to the wisdom of going on with the enterprise. As senior naval officer, it lay in his discretion to break off the voyage and turn back, but this he was loath to do, knowing the immensity of the issues at stake. Whatever decision he came to must be reached on his own responsibility, for his orders expressly enjoined him not to send radio signals after leaving Wake Island until the landing had been accomplished, or unless Japanese warships appeared. He was thus debarred from communicating with the commander-in-chief of the battle fleet, or with any other authority competent to instruct him. At length, after conferring with General Dykman, who entered a strong protest against turning back, he made up his mind to proceed. Whether he erred in taking this course is a question which has since provoked endless discussion. Since Admiral Doyle did not himself survive the expedition, we are left in doubt as to the considerations which led him to form his resolve. It can only be said that the facts, so far as they are known, fully warranted his reluctance to abandon the voyage. The sinking of 2 transports, with the loss of nearly 1,100 troops and valuable war stores, was admittedly a heavy blow, but it could hardly be said to have so weakened the force as to rule out all chance of success. Much more serious from the strictly practical point of view was the loss of the motor lighters and the extensive damage to cargo handling gear, for these factors were to have played a supremely important role in the actual landing. But Admiral Doyle had good grounds for believing that the invading army, together with its equipment, could still be thrown on shore before the Japanese fleet had time to intervene, always assuming the preliminary gas offensive to have done its work. If enemy battleships were not at sea, the only naval forces likely to be encountered would be torpedo craft and submarines, or, at the very worst, light cruisers. And to deal with these, Admiral Doyle had his 3 cruisers and numerous destroyers. In view of these circumstances, impartial historians will acquit him of having acted rashly in deciding to proceed with the venture. Owing to the delay caused by the storm and the sinking of the 2 transports, the morning of January 8, 1932, found the flotilla still some 250 miles to the eastward of the Bonins. Here it was to have been joined by the airplane carrier squadron under Captain Miller, but when the rendezvous was reached, no trace of these ships could be discerned. The expedition, it was true, was 48 hours behind time, but it was scarcely conceivable that Captain Miller had failed to allow for the possibility of delay. Admiral Doyle assumed, therefore, that his colleague was in the vicinity and dispatched 4 destroyers to look for him. Airplanes from the Minneapolis and the Concord were also flown off to join in the search. But, in fact, Captain Miller's squadron was still at a considerable distance from the rendezvous. He, too, had met with heavy weather some 10 days before, and the shafter had sustained such damage to her rudder and one of the screws as practically to disable her. An attempt was made to repair the injury to the rudder, but without success, and there was nothing for it but to take the vessel in tow. As her starboard propeller was still in action, she was able, with the assistance of the Saratoga's towing spring, to maintain a speed of 14 knots. But since this was some knots less than the collective speed of the squadron, its voyage was seriously retarded. Perceiving that he would be several days late in arriving at the rendezvous, Captain Miller detached his only escort cruiser, the Cincinnati, Captain Edwards, to try to establish contact with the expeditionary force and explain the situation. His destroyers he kept with him, for the squadron was now within the radius of submarine attack, and, with a partially disabled ship on his hands, he could afford to take no chances. Shortly after dawn on January 8th, the Cincinnati observed a periscope less than 1,000 yards ahead, and almost simultaneously, 2 torpedoes were seen approaching. These were easily avoided by a touch of the helm, but before the cruiser could open fire, the enemy had disappeared. 5 minutes later, a second submarine was observed on the surface, too far off for torpedo attack. Several shots were fired at her, but she dived before the range could be found. Fearing lest the airplane carriers should run into an ambush, Captain Edwards flashed a message to Captain Miller, giving the position in which the submarines had been sighted. He used his radio without hesitation, knowing that his presence would in any case be reported to Japanese headquarters by the submarine scouts which had intercepted him. Moreover, since he had been detected comparatively near the Bonins, the enemy would certainly jump to the conclusion that an assault on the islands was impending and instantly take countermeasures. The entire situation had thus undergone a radical change. Surprise was now out of the question. Not only would the garrison be warned, but, what was far more serious, every Japanese warship within call would soon be rushing toward the islands. Even the battleships, provided they were at Yokosuka, could reach Port Lloyd in 24 hours. That a general alarm had been sounded was made clear by the radio activity which now ensued. In the space of a few hours, scores of messages were taken in by the Cincinnati, but being in Japanese code, they could not be read. Nevertheless, their significance was unmistakable. The Cincinnati's message reporting enemy submarines had reached Captain Miller at 6:30 a.m. Fully alive to the critical posture of affairs, his whole concern now was for the safety of the transport convoy, of whose whereabouts he was still ignorant. He therefore ordered the Cincinnati to continue her search. It was clear, of course, that the projected attack on the Bonins could not now take place. Consequently, the airplane carriers were no longer needed, and it was essential to their safety that they should be withdrawn as quickly as possible from what would speedily become a highly dangerous area. But since a fast and powerful carrier like his flagship, the Saratoga, with her complement of bombing planes, would be invaluable for covering the retreat of the transports, he proposed to join up with the convoy, while the three other carriers, including the disabled Shafter, steamed eastward until they made contact with the battle fleet. By this time, Admiral Dallinger, the commander-in-chief, had been apprised of the situation, the full gravity of which was painfully evident to him. His position was, roughly, 450 miles to the northwest of Wake, and therefore about 1,200 miles from the Bonins. Although still unaware of the delay to which the expeditionary force had been subjected by reason of the storm and the sinking of two transports, the fact that it had not yet joined the airplane carrier squadron showed that a fatal hitch had occurred in the program. If, as he surmised, the transports were now nearing the Bonins, it meant that the Japanese fleet from Yokosuka could reach them in less than half the time it would take him to do so. And he knew that Admiral Doyle's small force could offer no serious resistance to such an overwhelming attack. In face of this appalling danger, no effective action seemed possible. But although his worst forebodings seemed to be confirmed, the commander-in-chief was in no doubt as to what he should do. His fleet had expended approximately one-third of its fuel during the voyage from Midway, so that enough remained for a prolonged run at high speed, though it was essential to preserve a margin for the homeward journey. Still, the safety of the expeditionary force overrode every other consideration for the time being. And so, at 8 a.m. on January 8th, the three battle divisions, comprising the swiftest of the heavy ships, with their attendant cruisers and destroyers, were driving westward at a speed of 18 knots, steering a course direct for Port Lloyd. In the meantime, however, we must revert to the expeditionary force, which circumstances had placed in extreme jeopardy. When the coming of daylight on January 8th failed to reveal the airplane carriers which were to have met him, Admiral Doyle, as we have seen, sent out destroyers and air scouts to locate the missing squadron. Pending news of it, he deemed it prudent to alter course to the north, from which direction the carriers were expected to come, rather than hold on toward the Bonins. At 7:30 a.m. he intercepted the Cincinnati's signal to Captain Miller, reporting enemy submarines, and at once realized all that this portended. The expedition, he saw, must be abandoned forthwith, for the enemy would now be on the alert, and it could only be a question of hours before powerful Japanese forces were converging upon him. Orders were accordingly given for the convoy to retrace its course at the highest speed possible. The destroyers sent out to reconnoiter were recalled. Half an hour later came the welcome intelligence from one of the Minneapolis's airplanes that the Cincinnati was in sight. She arrived by noon, and Admiral Doyle learned from her that the Saratoga was racing at full speed to join his flag. By 5 p.m., the convoy was 350 miles to the west of the Bonins, and as every hour reduced the danger of pursuit by the Japanese main fleet, those on board began to breathe more freely. But the evil fortune which had dogged the expedition almost from the start had not yet deserted it. When the general warning was sent out from Yokosuka on January 8th, the Japanese main body was at sea, cruising about 300 miles due east of that port. At the same time, the South Seas Squadron, under Rear Admiral Isomura, was 50 miles northwest of the Mariana Islands, having left Sasebo 3 days before on a cruise to the South Seas. This squadron consisted of the Chitose flag, Yoshino, and Kasagi, 10,000-ton ships of recent construction, armed with 8-inch guns and possessing a speed of 34 knots, besides the smaller cruiser Ojai. A message relayed from Port Lloyd was received by Admiral Isomura, instructing him to cut off enemy forces which were believed to be 400 miles east or northeast of the Bonins, and he at once complied by ordering his ships to increase speed to 25 knots. The Japanese main fleet, being at so great a distance from the scene, had little chance of intervening, but 3 of its 28-knot battle cruisers were sent on ahead to join forces, if possible, with Admiral Isomura. Further to strengthen the pursuit, 12 big flying boats, with a great radius of action, were dispatched from Yokosuka and Kure to Port Lloyd, whence they were to cooperate with Admiral Isomura in locating the American force and bringing it to action. Finally, a division of submarines from Guam was ordered to cruise to westward of Wake Island, for which the Americans were thought to be heading, and to harass their retreat. These dispositions naturally were unknown to Admiral Doyle, but he can have been under no illusion as to the peril in which he stood. The convoy was maintaining a steady 12 knots. The flagship Minneapolis steamed ahead, with the Marblehead and Concord on either flank, while the destroyers formed an anti-submarine guard round the squadron, and the Cincinnati brought up the rear. The big airplane carrier Saratoga, with Captain Miller on board, arrived at 6 p.m. and was ordered to take station abreast of the flagship. And now, for the first time, those in the convoy had visual proof of the net that was closing round them. Heralded by the drone of their powerful engines, 2 large seaplanes were sighted coming up astern. They were greeted with a hot fire from the anti-aircraft guns of the Cincinnati, while the Saratoga sent up pursuit planes to engage them. One of the Japanese machines, flying over the convoy at a height of 5,000 feet, dropped 2 heavy bombs, but the aim was bad and no ship was hit. The other machine made for the Saratoga, apparently bent on delivering an attack from a low altitude, but before it could release any bombs, it was brought down by a shell bursting under it, some of the debris falling on the deck of the Minneapolis. The first plane, having discharged its bombs without effect, flew off to the westward, closely pursued by the fighters from the Saratoga, which were at least twice as speedy. In 5 minutes it was overtaken and brought down, after a brisk action in which one of the American planes also came to grief. Admiral Doyle knew, however, that the 2 Japanese scouts would have reported his position to the pursuing fleet before launching their attack. Twice during the night other airplanes were heard, but no bombs were dropped. It was now all but certain that the morrow would decide the fate of the expedition. If the next 24 hours passed without bringing a superior force of enemy ships on the scene, the convoy would probably be safe, for the Japanese, knowing as they must that the American battle fleet was steaming westward at full speed, would certainly not press the pursuit so far. But with the first glimmer of dawn on the 9th came unmistakable signs of danger. On the southwest horizon smoke was observed, from which soon emerged the dim shapes of 4 large vessels. Planes sent up to scout signaled the approach of enemy cruisers, which appeared to be of powerful design. It was indeed the squadron of Admiral Isomura, who, having found his quarry, was coming up at maximum speed to strike a deadly blow for the cause of Nippon. At first sight, the opposing forces did not seem unequally matched. Each contained 4 cruisers, and although the Minneapolis was the only American ship that mounted 8-inch guns against 3 Japanese vessels so armed, Admiral Doyle had his 30 destroyers, not to speak of the Saratoga, whose planes might well turn the balance in his favor. The enemy had no destroyers, and their only airplanes were those carried on board the cruisers. Had Admiral Doyle been free to handle his fighting ships as a tactical unit, he might, nay probably would, have had the best of the duel. But cumbered as he was with the flock of slow and helpless transports, which must on no account be left unguarded, his freedom of action was necessarily restricted. Line of battle was formed at 7 a.m., the enemy then being 23,000 yards away. The Minneapolis and her three smaller consorts, in line ahead, were on the starboard side of the transports, which had been ordered to steer a course to the northeast. 12 destroyers were told off to guard them, for the danger of submarine attack was ever present. The Saratoga, occupying a station between the transports and the battle line, was out of range of gunfire, and yet in a favorable position to send her planes either to support Admiral Doyle or repel an attack on the convoy, as circumstances required. The 20 destroyers retained with the squadron were disposed ahead and to starboard of the flagship, ready to attack the enemy's line with torpedoes at the word of command. While these dispositions were being made, more Japanese seaplanes were observed coming up from the west, though at too great a height to be reached by gunfire. They had come from the Bonins and formed part of the contingent of long-range flying boats which had left Yokosuka and Kura on the previous day. With a cruising endurance of 3,000 miles, they were able to keep aloft for 2 days at a time. It was from the radiophone reports of these aircraft that Admiral Isomura obtained that early and precise intelligence of the enemy's formation, which enabled him to deliver his attack with telling effect. To quote from the Japanese Naval Staff history of the war, "On learning the respective positions of the American columns, he at once ordered the Kasagi to make a detour and sweep down upon the transports from the north, while the admiral himself, with his 3 other ships, held the American naval squadron under fire." Observing that one of the Japanese cruisers withdrew from the line and steamed north at high speed, Admiral Doyle, as we know from surviving officers of his staff, realized immediately what was intended. His first instinct was to turn his whole line 16 points and hasten in pursuit, but a moment's reflection showed him the futility of such a procedure. As the 3 Japanese cruisers, which were now running almost parallel with him, but gradually closing the range, held on unswervingly, it was plain that if he turned in pursuit of the Kasagi, they would themselves steer straight for the transports. The most he could do was to signal the destroyers with the convoy to head off the Kasagi at all costs, at the same time ordering the Saratoga to launch planes against her. Even as these orders were being issued, the action opened with a salvo from the Japanese flagship, which, with the Yoshino and Ohi, had now closed to 18,000 yards. But this distance, although nominally within the reach of their 8-inch guns, was too great for effective practice, and for some time the shooting was erratic. Not until the range was down to 16,000 yards did Admiral Doyle give the word to open fire. All his ships opened on the enemy, but the 6-inch projectiles from the Cincinnati, Marblehead, and Concord were seen to be falling short. The third 8-inch salvo from the Minneapolis straddled the Chitose, and the cannonade from both sides now rose to a crescendo of fury. Admiral Doyle tried repeatedly to close the range in order to bring the 6-inch guns of his other ships into action, but the enemy each time turned away, keeping just inside the 16,000-yard limit at which they reaped the full benefit of their higher-powered artillery. Moreover, they were forging rapidly ahead, for Admiral Doyle dared not let himself be lured too far away from his transports, and accordingly had not yet exceeded 20 knots, though his adversaries were doing at least 25. But at this juncture he raised speed to 23, for the Japanese were plainly trying to cross his T, that is, to cut across the head of his line and subject it to enfilade fire, a maneuver that would also open the transports to direct attack. It was to circumvent this design that the American commander put on more speed. As the Japanese had already turned inward 4 points, the 2 squadrons were now converging at high velocity, and the range dropped swiftly from 16,000 yards to 12,000, and for a short interval, even to 9,000 yards. This proved the hottest phase of the action. Each side was firing with the utmost rapidity, and hitting had begun in earnest. A well-placed 8-inch salvo from the Minneapolis struck the Chitose amidships, bringing down her forward funnel and starting a big fire. 2 minutes later, the Minneapolis herself received several hits in succession, one of which wrecked the conning tower, killing Admiral Doyle on the spot and laying low all its other occupants. Momentarily out of control, the flagship yawed badly, presenting her bows to the enemy, who plastered her with bursting shell before she could be swung back into line. It was now 8 a.m. The battle had been in progress a full hour, but it continued to rage with unabated fury. At 8:05 a.m., the Ohi, upon which the Cincinnati had been concentrating rapid salvos, was seen to be dropping astern in a grievous plight. Her quarterdeck was blazing, dense clouds of steam arose, and few of her guns remained in action. 3 more broadsides finished her. Following a terrific explosion amidships, she turned over and went to the bottom at 8:15. But she did not pass unavenged. Already the Japanese preponderance in heavy metal had begun to tell. The Minneapolis, with 2 turrets knocked out and half a dozen great gaps yawning in her side, was nearing the limit of her endurance. In the Marblehead, 8-inch shells had wrecked the entire forward battery, while others, penetrating the sides of the ship, had caused so much water to enter that she had a heavy list to starboard. This not only brought down her speed, but prevented her guns from bearing on the enemy. The Concorde also had received extensive damage, though she was still able to steam and fight most of her guns, albeit with scratch crews, most of the original gun parties having been killed or wounded by heavy splinters which the thin turret and casemate armor failed to keep out. The Cincinnati, engaged principally with the lightly armed Ohi, 7 5.5-inch guns, had escaped serious injury, her only bad hit being a shell in the forward boiler room. On the Japanese side, the Chitose had 1 turret disabled, her port engines were wrecked, and fires were raging in several parts of the ship. The Yoshino had only superficial damage until she was hit by a torpedo, the only one that found a billet in spite of several attacks by the American destroyers, and even this failed to disable her, exploding as it did a few feet from the bows. At an early stage of the engagement, Admiral Doyle had ordered his destroyers to attack. This they proceeded to do with the utmost gallantry, in the teeth of a hurricane fire that took a heavy toll of the flotilla. 5 boats were sunk outright or disabled in the first onslaught, and not one of the 20 or 30 torpedoes they discharged scored a hit. In the second attack, the Yoshino was hit, but again the aggressors were driven off with heavy loss. Of the 20 boats originally with the squadron, only 9 were still battle-worthy. It was now 8:45 a.m., and Admiral Isamura made a determined attempt to end the business. Signaling the Yoshino to concentrate on the Minneapolis, he turned his own big guns on the same target, ordering rapid fire. Under this terrible punishment, the American flagship seemed literally to crumple up. Her sides being almost bare of armor, the 250-pounder shell hacked her through and through, whilst repeated detonations had ruptured the armor deck in more than one place, causing fragments to rain down on the machinery. Cascades of water were also pouring below, putting out the furnaces and driving stokers and engineers from their posts. Finally, the ship, ceasing to move, lay helpless under the hail of fire and steel that continued to beat upon her. The Marblehead, sorely wounded though she was, made a valiant effort to shield the flagship by interposing her own battered hull between the enemy and their prey. But it was too late. The Minneapolis, now at her last gasp, made her final plunge at 9:05, destroyers rescuing 80 officers and men from the water. Having disposed of his chief antagonist, the Japanese admiral steamed in to finish off the rest of the American squadron. His 2 ships were pouring shell into the Marblehead, and also hitting the Concorde freely, when they found themselves assailed in turn by a flight of planes, which rained down gas and phosphorus bombs. The Chitose bore the brunt of this attack, and suffered severely, especially from the gas fumes, which disabled every man on deck and soon percolated through into the turrets and lower compartments. Enveloped in a shroud of noxious vapor, shot here and there with livid flame, the big cruiser turned sharply away, seemingly quite out of control, with every gun silent. At this moment, the destroyers Goldsboro and Preston, observing the enemy's plight, dashed forward and fired their tubes at a range of only 500 yards. Most of the torpedoes struck home together, the detonations merging in a single thunderous roar, while tongues of fire leapt as high as the masthead. As the smoke lifted, the Chitose was seen to be on her beam ends, and 2 minutes later she capsized and sank. While American destroyers were searching for survivors, the airplanes were fiercely assailing the Yoshino, which ship was now in full flight. Although hit several times, with half her crew gassed into insensibility, she contrived to make good her escape. That the American aircraft had only intervened at this belated stage of the fight was due to their previous engagement with the Kasagi, the ship, it will be recalled, which had been detached by Admiral Isamura to raid the transport fleet. Probably she would never have got within range of the objective had the Saratoga been able to send up her planes promptly, but the huge aircraft carrier had first to endure a determined attack by 4 Japanese flying boats which bombed her from a low ceiling, inflicting considerable damage. They were soon driven away, but on account of injuries to the flight deck, her planes could only be flown off with difficulty. And meanwhile, the Kasagi was playing havoc among the defenseless transports. On first approaching, she was met by the destroyers Hopewell, Evans, Farragut, and Xylan, which rushed headlong to the attack, but so well directed was her fire that the 2 latter were sunk and the others beaten back, none of their torpedoes making a hit. One of her earliest victims was the destroyer tender Melville, blown up by a shell which evidently touched off the warheads in her torpedo magazine. Other ships sunk by the Kasagi's shells were the Lake Champlain, Spokane Falls, and West Point, while the Cheyenne Bridge and 3 others were more or less badly hit. Just when it seemed as though nothing could save the whole convoy from annihilation, the first planes from the Saratoga came swooping down to the rescue. It was no time for caution, and the American airmen, entirely disregarding the Kasagi's anti-aircraft guns, held on until they could be sure of hitting the mark. Their heavy gas bombs, which had been intended for the batteries at Port Lloyd, crashed into the Japanese cruiser, whilst other missiles, each containing 600 pounds of explosive, destroyed her topworks. More than one of the low-flying planes, caught in the blast of its own bombs, fell into the sea. But the rest continued to attack until every bomb had been expended. By then the Kasagi was in a hopeless case. 4/5 of her crew had been stricken down by the gas, and there was no one left to point a gun when the 5 remaining destroyers of the convoy guard charged forward to administer the death blow. 3 torpedoes sufficed. As the enemy ship lay deep in the water just before foundering, it was noticed that only a score or so of men made any effort to save themselves. Hundreds of their comrades, overcome by gas, went down with the ship, mercifully unconscious of their doom. The action was now over, and it remained to count the cost. Of the 4 cruisers which had comprised Admiral Isamura's squadron, all but one had been sunk. According to Japanese statements after the war, their loss in personnel in this fight exceeded 1,200. On the American side, the Minneapolis had gone, together with the tender Melville. The Marblehead, already in a sinking condition, eventually had to be dispatched by a torpedo, and the Concord, with extensive damage to hull and machinery, was just able to move, but no more. Only the Cincinnati had escaped serious hurt. 8 of the destroyers had sunk, and 3 others were scarcely seaworthy. Upwards of 1,000 officers and men had perished in the squadron. Apart from injury to her flight deck, the Saratoga was still in battle trim. It was, however, upon the troopship convoy that the worst blow had fallen. Here there was a ghastly list of casualties, including men drowned in the 3 sunken transports. The loss of life throughout the convoy reached a total of 4,000, while thousands more were wounded. Nor was this all. Some of the vessels were so battered by gunfire that they could no longer move, whilst others could steam only with difficulty. And the danger of further attack still existed, for there was no telling what new enemy forces might yet be in pursuit. Had Admiral Isamura's squadron been the vanguard of the enemy's battle fleet? And, if so, how long would it be ere his battleships came up to blow the remnants of the convoy out of the water? These were the ominous questions that were heard in the transports. With only 1 cruiser, a few destroyers, and the Saratoga in condition to fight, no defense worth the name could be offered in the event of a fresh assault. But in fact, the worst was now over, for the Japanese battlecruisers had been ordered to abandon the pursuit when radio signals from the American battle fleet were intercepted. At 3 p.m. on the 9th, the big dirigible Chicago, scouting in advance of the battle fleet, came in sight of the convoy, and after communicating with Captain Miller, proceeded to reconnoiter towards the west. 4 hours later, this airship, then 200 miles to the west, reported that no enemy ships were in sight. It was clear, therefore, that the pursuit was not being pressed. Most fortunately, the weather continued to be favorable, since had another gale arisen, some of the shattered transports must have been lost. With the few surviving destroyers guarding either flank, and with the disabled ships in tow, the convoy steamed slowly in the direction of Wake Island. During the morning of the 10th, it was twice attacked by submarines, the Concord receiving the coup de grace, and one torpedo narrowly missing the Cincinnati, whilst another hit but failed to sink the transport Garfield. Driven off by destroyers, the enemy did not renew the attack. At dusk on the following day, the 10,000-ton cruisers Portland, Indianapolis, and Kansas City came up. They had been sent ahead by the commander-in-chief to guard the convoy over the last stage of the journey. With the coming of these powerful warships, there remained only the peril of submarine attack, and even this risk would disappear when contact was made with the destroyers of the battle fleet. Having been kept informed of the progress of events, and knowing that there was no longer any chance of meeting the Japanese main body, Admiral Dallinger had reduced his speed to 12 knots with a view to saving fuel. He had also ordered 2 of the battleship divisions to return to Wake, coming on himself with the flagship, the Colorado, Maryland, and California, accompanied by 2 hospital ships. The convoy was sighted at 4 p.m. on the 13th, and after the worst of the wounded cases had been transferred to the hospital ships, the combined force continued its voyage. At Wake Island, which was reached on the 15th, tankers and supply ships were found waiting. Here a stay of 2 days was made, while the ships were refueled and damaged hulls temporarily repaired. It was found necessary to scuttle 2 of the half-disabled transports. Then, on the 17th, the remaining ships of the original convoy sailed for Hawaii under a strong escort of destroyers. Honolulu was reached on January 25th. The ill-starred expedition was over, and to this day its survivors still marvel that any one of them lived to tell the tale.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.